On a crisp September morning, in one of the gilded salons of the Élysée Palace, Emmanuel Macron stood by the window, gazing out at the misty Parisian landscape. Steam rose from the coffee cup in his hands, mirroring the complexity of his thoughts. Throughout his years as President of France, he had faced many difficult decisions, but the one he was about to make might well shape the future of Europe itself. A gentle knock came at the door, and his chief of staff, Philippe Grandjean, entered with a manila folder tucked under his arm. The man's usually composed demeanor showed traces of tension around his eyes. "Monsieur le Président," Philippe began, his voice carrying the weight of the moment. "The final briefing documents are ready. The European Defense Council is expecting your decision within the hour." Macron turned away from the window, setting his cup down on the ornate mahogany desk that had witnessed countless historic moments. The folder Philippe placed before him contained the culmination of months of secret negotiations, strategic planning, and political maneuvering. Inside were the blueprints for what could become the most significant shift in European geopolitics since the formation of NATO itself. The European Defense Union project had been brewing in the corridors of European capitals for years, but never with such urgency and potential for realization. As Macron opened the folder, his eyes scanned the familiar pages one final time. The proposal was audacious in its scope: a unified European military command structure, independent of NATO, with its own intelligence sharing networks, joint procurement systems, and rapid deployment capabilities. "The German Chancellor called this morning," Philippe continued, settling into the chair across from the President. "She's fully committed. The Italian Prime Minister sent word through diplomatic channels that Rome is ready to sign. Even the Spanish are on board, despite their traditional caution about military matters." Macron nodded slowly, his fingers drumming against the desk's surface. The support from major European powers was crucial, but he knew that this decision would reverberate far beyond the continent's borders. Across the Atlantic, in the halls of power in Washington, D.C., another leader was likely receiving his own morning briefings, and Macron could almost imagine the reaction this announcement would provoke. Donald Trump had returned to the presidency with his characteristic unpredictability and his well-documented skepticism about multilateral alliances. The relationship between France and the United States had always been complex, a dance of cooperation and competition that dated back to the founding of both republics. But in recent months, the tensions had been growing more pronounced. "What's the intelligence assessment on the American reaction?" Macron asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Philippe opened a second folder, this one bearing the seal of the Direction Générale de la Sécurité Extérieure, France's external intelligence service. The DGSE believes President Trump will view this as a direct challenge to American hegemony in European security affairs. Their psychological profile suggests he'll take it personally, seeing it as a betrayal of the alliance that has protected Europe since World War II. Macron leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers as he considered the implications. The irony was not lost on him that in trying to strengthen European security, he might actually be destabilizing the very foundations of Western defense cooperation. But the world had changed dramatically since NATO's founding in 1949, and Europe could no longer afford to be junior partners in their own security arrangements. The morning briefing continued with updates from across the European Union. In Brussels, the European Commission President was coordinating with member states to ensure a unified response to whatever American pushback might come. In Berlin, the German Defense Ministry was already drawing up preliminary organizational charts for the new command structure. In Rome, military planners were identifying potential headquarters locations for the European Defense Union's Central Command. As Philippe concluded his briefing and departed, Macron found himself alone again with perhaps the most consequential decision of his presidency. He walked to the window once more, looking out at the city that had witnessed revolutions, wars, and the birth of modern democracy. Paris had always been a city that understood the weight of history, and today, history was about to take another dramatic turn. The president picked up his secure phone and dialed a number he knew by heart. Within moments, he was connected to Chancellor Angela Merkel's successor in Berlin. "Good morning, Chancellor." Macron began in German, a courtesy that had become second nature in their frequent conversations. I wanted to personally confirm before we proceed. Are you absolutely certain that Germany is prepared for the consequences of this decision? The voice on the other end was steady, resolute. Monsieur le Président, we have discussed this exhaustively. The German people deserve a Europe that can defend itself. The time for dependence is over. Similar calls followed to Rome, Madrid, and other European capitals. Each conversation reinforced Macron's conviction that this was not just France's decision, but Europe's collective choice to step into a new era of strategic autonomy. The continent that had been rebuilt after World War II with American help was now ready to stand as an equal partner on the world stage. At precisely noon, Macron made his way to the Élysées press room, where journalists from around the world had been hastily assembled for what the palace had described only as a major announcement regarding European security cooperation. The room buzzed with speculation. Cameras focused on the podium where the French president would shortly make history. As Macron approached the microphone, the room fell silent. The weight of centuries seemed to press down upon this moment, the culmination of European dreams that dated back to the visions of Jean Monnet and Robert Schuman, the founding fathers of European integration. Ladies and gentlemen, Macron began, his voice carrying across the room, through the miracle of modern communications to capitals around the world. Today marks a historic milestone in the evolution of European cooperation and our continent's place in the global security architecture. He paused, allowing the gravity of the moment to settle upon his audience. After extensive consultations with our European partners, I am proud to announce the establishment of the European Defense Union, a comprehensive framework for collective security that will ensure Europe's ability to defend its interests, values, and citizens in an increasingly complex global environment. The announcement sent immediate shockwaves through the press room, and within minutes through diplomatic channels around the world. Macron continued his prepared remarks, outlining the structure of the new defense arrangement, its goals of strategic autonomy while maintaining transatlantic partnerships, and the timeline for its implementation. But even as he spoke, thousands of miles away in Washington, D.C., another drama was unfolding. President Donald Trump was in the Oval Office when his national security advisor burst through the door, tablet in hand, his face flushed with urgency. "Mr. President," the advisor began, setting the tablet on the resolute desk, "you need to see this immediately. Macron just announced the formation of a European army, independent of NATO." Trump looked up from the stack of papers he had been reviewing, his expression shifting from mild annoyance at the interruption to sharp focus as the implications became clear. He took the tablet and watched Macron's announcement, his jaw tightening with each passing sentence. "After 80 years, Trump muttered, his voice rising, 80 years of American blood and treasure, protecting these people, and this is how they repay us." He stood up abruptly, the chair rolling backward. "Get me Macron on the phone, now." The National Security Advisor hesitated. "Sir, he's still in the middle of the press conference. Perhaps we should wait until—" "I don't care if he's meeting with the Pope," Trump snapped. "Get him on the line, and get me a statement ready for the press. These Europeans need to understand what they're throwing away." Within minutes, the White House communications team was drafting a response, while diplomatic channels were lighting up with urgent messages. The Secretary of State was pulled out of a meeting with congressional leaders. The Defense Secretary was briefed while en route to the Pentagon. And America's European ambassadors were instructed to seek immediate meetings with their host governments. As Macron concluded his press conference in Paris, answering questions about the timing, structure, and implications of the European Defense Union, his phone was already buzzing with urgent messages from his staff. The American reaction was swift, and as predicted, intensely negative. Trump's first response came via his preferred medium, Twitter. Within an hour of Macron's announcement, a series of tweets appeared on the presidential account that sent diplomatic relations into freefall. "France thinks it can go it alone after 80 years of American protection. We saved them twice in world wars, and this is the thanks we get." Maybe it's time for Europe to find out what the world looks like without American leadership. The tweets continued, each one more inflammatory than the last. Macron talks about European independence. But who's going to pay for this European army? The same countries that can barely meet their NATO commitments. American taxpayers are tired of subsidizing Europe's defense while they stab us in the back. In the corridors of the Élysée Palace, Macron's advisors watched the digital firestorm with growing concern. They had expected a strong American reaction, but Trump's public outburst was more personal and vitriolic than their worst-case scenarios had predicted. Should we respond immediately? Philippe asked, reviewing the stream of increasingly hostile tweets on his phone. Macron, who had returned to his office after the press conference, considered the question carefully. No, he said finally. Let him exhaust himself with this tantrum. We will respond with dignity and substance, not Twitter diplomacy. But Trump was far from exhausted. Within hours, he had convened an emergency meeting of his cabinet and senior advisors. The Roosevelt Room filled with the nation's top diplomatic and military officials as the president outlined his view of the crisis. This is nothing short of a betrayal, Trump declared, pacing behind his chair. For decades, we've maintained tens of thousands of troops in Europe, spent hundreds of billions on their defense, and provided the nuclear umbrella that has kept the peace. And now they want to replace us? The Secretary of Defense, a career military officer who understood the complexities of alliance politics, tried to inject a note of caution into the discussion. Mr. President, we should consider that the European Defense Union might complement rather than compete with NATO. Perhaps we can find a way to work together. Work together? Trump interrupted. They didn't consult us. They didn't even give us a heads up. This was planned behind our backs. And now you want me to shake hands and pretend it's all fine? The Secretary of State, experienced in the delicate art of diplomatic crisis management, proposed a different approach. Sir, I recommend we reach out through diplomatic channels to understand exactly what the Europeans have in mind. Perhaps there's room for negotiation, for finding a structure that preserves American interests while acknowledging European aspirations. Trump's response was swift and decisive. No negotiations. They want to go their own way. Fine, but they can't have it both ways. They can't have American protection and European independence. It's time they learned what independence really costs. The meeting concluded with instructions that would reshape American foreign policy toward Europe. The U.S. ambassador to France was recalled for consultations, a move that hadn't occurred since the Iraq War disagreements of 2003. Military cooperation programs were put under review, and the Treasury Department was asked to prepare a range of economic pressure options. As news of the ambassador's recall reached Paris, the crisis entered a new phase. What had begun as a policy disagreement was now a full diplomatic confrontation between the world's oldest republic and one of its most important allies. In the days that followed, the crisis deepened and spread across the Atlantic Alliance. European capitals found themselves forced to choose sides, while global markets reacted nervously to the prospect of a fundamental realignment in Western security arrangements. German Chancellor's office issued a statement strongly supporting France's initiative, calling it a natural evolution of European integration and a necessary step toward strategic autonomy. The statement was carefully worded to avoid directly criticizing the United States, but its meaning was clear. Germany stood with France. Italy's prime minister went further, declaring in a television interview that Europe has grown up and no longer needed to be treated as a junior partner in global affairs. We respect our American friends, he said. But friendship must be based on equality, not dependence. The reaction from Eastern European nations was more complex. Poland, with its deep historical fear of Russian aggression and strong ties to the United States, found itself in an impossible position. The Polish president attempted to navigate between the competing pressures, calling for dialogue and compromise, while privately expressing concerns about the implications for NATO's Article 5 collective defense guarantee. In London, the British Prime Minister faced a particularly delicate situation. Having left the European Union, The United Kingdom was not part of the European Defence Union initiative, but its relationship with both France and the United States made neutrality nearly impossible. The Prime Minister's carefully worded statement called for calm heads and constructive dialogue, while avoiding any direct endorsement of either position. As the diplomatic crisis unfolded, the human drama at its center intensified. Macron, despite maintaining public composure, was privately struggling with the personal dimension of the conflict with Trump. The two leaders had met several times during Trump's first presidency, and while their relationship had never been easy, it had been professionally functional. The French president's closest advisors later described his mood during those crucial first days as determined but troubled. He believed deeply that this was the right decision for Europe, one aide recalled, but he also understood that it might fundamentally alter the Western alliance that had kept peace for nearly 8 decades. Trump, meanwhile, appeared to be taking the European initiative as a personal affront. Those close to him reported that he viewed Macron's announcement not as a strategic decision by a sovereign nation, but as a betrayal by someone he had considered, if not a friend, at least a partner he could work with. The personal nature of Trump's reaction became even more apparent when he granted an interview to a conservative news network 3 days after Macron's announcement. Sitting in the Oval Office with the presidential seal prominently displayed behind him, Trump delivered what many observers later characterized as his most hostile public criticism of a European leader. "I thought Macron was different," Trump said, his voice carrying a tone of wounded betrayal. "I thought he understood what America has done for France, what we've sacrificed. My grandfather's generation died on the beaches of Normandy to free his country, and this is how he honors that sacrifice." The interview continued for nearly an hour, with Trump ranging across decades of American-French relations, from World War II to the present crisis. He criticized French trade practices, questioned France's contribution to global security, and suggested that perhaps it was time for America to let Europe find out what the world looks like without us. The interview's most explosive moment came when Trump directly addressed Macron. "Emmanuel, if you're watching this, you know what you need to do to fix this. America has been generous, maybe too generous, but our patience isn't unlimited." In Paris, Macron's team watched the interview with growing alarm. The American president's tone suggested that this was no longer a policy disagreement but a personal vendetta. The decision was made that Macron would need to respond publicly, matching Trump's directness while maintaining the dignity of his office. The response came 2 days later, in an interview with French television that was broadcast live across Europe and picked up by international networks worldwide. Seated in his official office, with the French flag visible behind him, Macron presented a stark contrast to Trump's emotional approach. "France has the highest respect for the United States and the American people." Macron began, his voice calm and measured, "but respect must be mutual. Europe is not America's backyard, and Europeans are not America's subjects. We are partners, allies, but partners choose their own path." When asked directly about Trump's personal criticisms, Macron's response was diplomatic but firm. "I have great respect for President Trump and the office he holds, but the era when European policy was dictated from Washington is over. This is not about ingratitude or betrayal. This is about maturity and equality in the Atlantic relationship." The interview did little to calm tensions. If anything, it seemed to crystallize the fundamental disagreement at the heart of the crisis. Two completely different visions of what the transatlantic relationship should look like in the 21st century. As the crisis entered its second week, the economic dimensions began to manifest. Financial markets, initially hopeful that the diplomatic tensions would remain isolated, began to show signs of concern as it became clear that the confrontation was deepening rather than resolving. The euro weakened against the dollar as investors worried about the implications of a fundamental rift in Western unity. European defense stocks, paradoxically, rose as markets anticipated increased military spending, while American firms with significant European operations saw their shares decline. More significantly, Trump began to hint at economic consequences for European ingratitude. In a series of tweets and public statements, He suggested that American companies might need to reconsider their European investments, and that trade deals might need to be re-evaluated in light of Europe's new independent stance. The threat of economic retaliation sent shockwaves through European capitals. While the European Defense Union had strong political support, European leaders were acutely aware of their economic interdependence with the United States. The prospect of a trade war alongside the diplomatic crisis raised the stakes dramatically. French finance minister called an emergency meeting of his European counterparts to coordinate a response to potential American economic pressure. The meeting, held in Brussels, produced a joint statement affirming European unity and warning against any attempt to use economic coercion to influence sovereign defense decisions. Europe will not be intimidated, the statement declared, either militarily or economically. We seek partnership with the United States, but we will not accept subordination. The statement was crafted carefully to avoid further escalation while making clear that Europe would not back down under pressure. But privately, several European leaders were beginning to question whether the continent was prepared for the full consequences of its new independent stance. The crisis took on new dimensions when other global powers began to weigh in. In Moscow, Russian President Vladimir Putin watched the Atlantic Alliance's disintegration with undisguised satisfaction. Speaking at a security conference in St. Petersburg, Putin observed that some of our Western colleagues are finally recognizing the realities of a multipolar world. China's response was more subtle but equally significant. In a carefully worded statement, the Chinese Foreign Ministry called for dialogue and mutual respect, while noting that all nations have the right to make sovereign decisions about their security arrangements. For European leaders, the support from authoritarian capitals was both unwelcome and concerning. The last thing they wanted was to appear aligned with Moscow and Beijing against Washington. But Putin and Xi Jinping's obvious pleasure at Western division only highlighted how dramatically the geopolitical landscape was shifting. The military dimension of the crisis began to manifest as well. American military commanders in Europe received instructions to review all cooperation agreements with their European counterparts. Joint training exercises were suspended pending policy clarification, and intelligence sharing arrangements came under scrutiny. The first concrete military consequence came when the Pentagon announced that a major joint exercise scheduled for the following month between American and French forces would be postponed indefinitely. The exercise, which had been planned for nearly a year and involved thousands of troops from both nations, had been intended to showcase transatlantic military cooperation. European military leaders watched these developments with growing concern. While the European Defense Union was designed to provide strategic autonomy, it would take years to develop the full capabilities needed for independent operations. In the meantime, European forces remained heavily dependent on American logistics, intelligence, and technological support. French Defense Minister convened an urgent meeting of his European counterparts to assess the immediate implications of reduced American cooperation. The meeting, classified but later leaked to the press, revealed significant gaps in European capabilities that would be difficult to fill quickly. "We have the will and the resources to defend ourselves," one participant was quoted as saying, "but we lack the time to develop all the necessary capabilities before American support is withdrawn." The revelation of European military vulnerabilities provided additional ammunition for critics of the Defense Union project. Opposition politicians in several European countries began to question whether the timing of the initiative had been wise, given the dramatic American reaction. In France, political opposition to Macron's decision began to coalesce around concerns about the economic and security risks of confronting the United States. Marine Le Pen, leader of the far-right National Rally, accused Macron of gambling with French security for the sake of his European vanity project. From the opposite end of the political spectrum, some left-wing politicians criticized Macron for not going far enough, arguing that Europe should have withdrawn from NATO entirely rather than creating a parallel structure. But polls showed that a majority of French citizens supported their president's initiative, even as they expressed concerns about the confrontation with America. The French public, with its deep tradition of independence and skepticism of foreign domination, seemed to appreciate Macron's willingness to stand up to American pressure. The crisis reached a new level of intensity when Trump announced that he was considering withdrawing American forces from Europe entirely. Speaking at a campaign-style rally in Ohio, Trump suggested that if Europeans wanted to defend themselves, America should let them do it alone. "We have 35,000 troops in Germany," Trump declared to the cheering crowd, "protecting people who don't seem to want our protection anymore. Maybe it's time to bring our boys home and let the Europeans figure out their own problems." The threat to withdraw American forces sent panic through European capitals, particularly those in Eastern Europe that felt most directly threatened by Russian aggression. The Polish government, caught between its loyalty to NATO and its support for European integration, found itself in an increasingly impossible position. Polish president called for an emergency meeting of NATO's North Atlantic Council, the alliance's governing body, to address the crisis. The meeting, held behind closed doors in Brussels, exposed the deep divisions that now ran through the Western alliance. American representatives at the meeting made clear that the United States viewed the European Defense Union as incompatible with NATO solidarity. European representatives argued that the new arrangement would strengthen rather than weaken collective defense by reducing European dependence on American capabilities. The meeting concluded without resolution, but with a commitment to continue discussions. However, the very fact that NATO's future was now in question represented a fundamental shift in the international order that had prevailed since the end of World War II. As the crisis entered its third week, efforts at mediation began to emerge from unexpected quarters. The Secretary-General of the United Nations, recognizing the global implications of Atlantic division, offered to host talks between European and American representatives. The Vatican, through its diplomatic channels, also attempted to play a mediating role, with Pope Francis personally calling both Macron and Trump to urge dialogue and compromise. The Pope's intervention highlighted the moral dimension of the crisis, with religious leaders worldwide expressing concern about the breakdown of unity among democratic nations. But the most significant mediation effort came from an unlikely source. The British Prime Minister, despite the United Kingdom's complex relationship with both the European Union and the United States, the Prime Minister proposed a series of private discussions aimed at finding a face-saving solution for all parties. The British proposal involved a phased approach to European defense integration that would preserve NATO's primacy while allowing for increased European cooperation. The plan, developed by experienced diplomats in London, was designed to give both sides enough of what they wanted to justify a climb down from their maximalist positions. Initial reactions to the British proposal were cautiously positive. European leaders appreciated the recognition of their desire for greater autonomy, while American officials saw potential for preserving essential alliance structures. But both Trump and Macron remained publicly committed to their positions, making any compromise politically difficult. The human dimension of the crisis became increasingly apparent as the confrontation dragged on. Macron, despite his public confidence, was reportedly struggling with the isolation that came with challenging the United States. European support was strong but not universal, and the economic costs of the confrontation were beginning to mount. Trump, meanwhile, faced criticism from some within his own party, who worried that his confrontational approach was damaging long-term American interests. Senior Republican senators privately urged the president to consider a more measured response, but their advice appeared to fall on deaf ears. The personal relationship between the two leaders continued to deteriorate as public statements became increasingly hostile. What had once been professional disagreement had become personal antagonism, making diplomatic resolution even more difficult. The crisis took on new urgency when intelligence reports suggested that Russia was beginning to probe European defenses, apparently testing whether the breakdown in Atlantic unity had created new vulnerabilities. Russian aircraft increased their flights near European borders, and naval activity in the Baltic Sea intensified. European military commanders found themselves in the uncomfortable position of having to respond to Russian provocations without the full support of American intelligence and logistics systems. While European forces were capable, the absence of seamless cooperation with American assets was immediately apparent. The first serious test came when Russian bombers flew unusually close to French airspace, requiring French fighter jets to scramble in response. The incident, which would normally have been routine, became complicated by the absence of the usual American intelligence support and coordination. French pilots successfully intercepted the Russian aircraft and escorted them away from French airspace. But the incident highlighted the immediate security implications of the Atlantic Rift. European leaders could no longer take American support for granted, even in routine defense operations. Public opinion in both Europe and America began to shift as the practical consequences of the diplomatic crisis became apparent. In Europe, polls showed growing concern about security implications, though support for the defense union remained strong. In America, opinion was more divided. While Trump's base supported his confrontational approach, moderate voters expressed worry about the long-term implications of alienating traditional allies. Business leaders, in particular, began to express concern about the economic costs of the confrontation. The first major economic consequence materialized when several European governments announced reviews of major defense contracts with American companies. Projects worth billions of dollars were suddenly in jeopardy as European leaders sought to demonstrate their independence from American suppliers. American defense contractors, recognizing the threat to their European business, began quietly lobbying the Trump administration to seek a resolution to the crisis. The involvement of corporate interests added a new dimension to the political calculations in Washington. As the crisis approached its fourth week, signs of potential compromise began to emerge. Trump's advisors, concerned about the broader implications of the confrontation, began to explore ways to claim victory while allowing for some European autonomy. European leaders, facing mounting economic and security pressures, also showed signs of flexibility. While unwilling to abandon the defense union project entirely, some suggested that its implementation could be modified to address American concerns. The breakthrough came during a private conversation between Macron and the British Prime Minister. The French president, according to later accounts, expressed willingness to consider modifications to the European defense union structure if it would preserve the broader Atlantic relationship. The conversation was followed by intense diplomatic activity, as British officials worked to craft a framework that might satisfy both sides. The proposal that emerged involved a phased implementation of the European Defense Union, with explicit provisions for NATO compatibility and American involvement in certain aspects of European defense planning. The proposal was carefully structured to allow both Trump and Macron to claim victory. The American president could argue that European defense remained subordinate to NATO and American leadership, while the French president could maintain that Europe had achieved greater strategic autonomy. Initial responses to the British framework were cautiously positive, but both sides remained publicly committed to their original positions. The challenge would be finding a way to accept the compromise without appearing to back down under pressure. The resolution process was complicated by the personal animosity that had developed between Trump and Macron. Both leaders had invested significant political capital in their positions, making any compromise potentially costly from a domestic political perspective. The turning point came when intelligence reports confirmed that Russian forces were actively probing NATO defenses, apparently seeking to exploit the alliance's internal divisions. The threat of external aggression provided both leaders with a justification for compromise that might not have existed otherwise. In a series of carefully choreographed moves, both sides began to signal flexibility. Trump suggested that he was open to European proposals that preserved American leadership, while Macron indicated willingness to consider modifications that maintained Atlantic unity. The final negotiations took place over a weekend at a secure location outside London, with the British Prime Minister serving as mediator. Both sides were represented by their most senior advisors, with clear instructions to find a face-saving solution. The agreement that emerged was complex and nuanced, designed to give both sides enough of what they wanted to justify acceptance. The European Defense Union would proceed, but with explicit provisions for NATO compatibility and American participation in planning processes. American forces would remain in Europe, but with modified roles that acknowledged European desires for greater autonomy. The agreement also included provisions for increased European defense spending and burden sharing, addressing one of Trump's primary concerns. The announcement of the agreement was carefully coordinated, with both leaders claiming victory for their approach. Trump emphasized the preservation of American leadership and the commitment to increased burden sharing, while Macron highlighted Europe's new strategic autonomy and partnership equality. Public reactions to the agreement were mixed, but generally positive. European publics appreciated the preservation of security cooperation while achieving greater independence. American opinion was more divided, with some viewing the agreement as necessary compromise and others as insufficient assertion of American interests. The crisis had lasting implications for transatlantic relations and the broader international order. While immediate tensions were resolved, the fundamental questions raised about American leadership and European autonomy remained unresolved. The months following the agreement saw continued friction as both sides worked to implement the complex arrangements they had negotiated. Trust, once damaged, proved difficult to restore, and both European and American leaders remained wary of future conflicts. The crisis also had broader geopolitical implications, demonstrating to other powers that the Western alliance was not as solid as it had appeared. China and Russia both drew lessons from the confrontation, adjusting their own strategies to account for potential Western divisions. In the end, the Atlantic crisis of 2025 represented both the resilience and the fragility of democratic alliances. While the immediate confrontation was resolved, the underlying tensions between American leadership and European autonomy remained a source of potential future conflict. The personal relationship between Trump and Macron never fully recovered from the crisis. While they maintained professional communications, the warmth and trust necessary for close cooperation had been permanently damaged. For Europe, the crisis marked a coming of age, a recognition that the continent could no longer rely entirely on American protection. The European Defense Union, even in its modified form, represented a significant step toward strategic autonomy. For America, the crisis highlighted the costs of confrontational diplomacy and the limits of even superpower influence. The realization that allies might choose independence over subordination marked a new phase in American foreign relations. The broader international community watched the crisis with concern and interest, recognizing that the resolution would shape global power relationships for decades to come. The maintenance of Western unity, even in modified form, disappointed those who had hoped for a complete breakdown of the Atlantic Alliance. As the dust settled from the crisis, both European and American leaders began the difficult work of rebuilding trust and cooperation. The agreement they had reached provided a framework, but the success of the new arrangements would depend on the goodwill and wisdom of leaders on both sides of the Atlantic. The legacy of the crisis would be felt for years to come, serving as both a warning about the fragility of international alliances and a testament to the possibility of resolving even the most serious diplomatic confrontations through patience, skill, and compromise. In the end, the Atlantic crisis of 2025 became a defining moment for the Western Alliance, marking the transition from American hegemony to a more complex and balanced partnership between equals. While the immediate danger of alliance breakdown had been averted, the fundamental transformation of transatlantic relations was permanent and irreversible. The world that emerged from the crisis was more complex and uncertain than the one that had existed before, but it was also more reflective of the changing balance of global power and the legitimate aspirations of democratic peoples for self-determination and equality in their international relationships. History would judge whether the resolution of the crisis represented wisdom and statesmanship or merely a temporary postponement of inevitable conflict. But for the moment, the Western Alliance had survived its greatest test since the end of the Cold War, emerging changed but intact, and perhaps stronger for having confronted and overcome its fundamental contradictions. 6 months after the resolution of the immediate crisis, the implementation of the complex agreement began to reveal both its strengths and weaknesses. The European Defense Union's first joint military exercise, conducted in the forests of Bavaria, involved forces from 6 European nations and was observed by American military attaches. The symbolism was powerful. Europe demonstrating its growing military capabilities while maintaining transparency with its Atlantic partner. General Marie-Claire Dubois, appointed as the first supreme commander of European forces, found herself walking a delicate tightrope. A career officer who had served in Afghanistan alongside American forces, she understood both the value of transatlantic cooperation and the European desire for strategic autonomy. Her first major challenge came when intelligence reports indicated unusual Chinese naval activity in the South China Sea, requiring a coordinated Western response. The crisis provided the first real test of the new Atlantic arrangements. European leaders, led by Macron, advocated for a measured diplomatic response combined with increased naval patrols. Trump, characteristically, favored a more confrontational approach, including the deployment of additional carrier battle groups to the region. The disagreement might have triggered a new crisis just months after the previous one, but the structures put in place during the London negotiations proved their worth. Instead of public recriminations, American and European defense officials worked through established channels to coordinate a response that satisfied both approaches. The successful navigation of the South China Sea incident marked a turning point in post-crisis relations. Both sides began to recognize that their new partnership model, while more complex than the old hierarchy, might actually be more effective in addressing 21st-century security challenges. But the personal dimension of the Trump-Macron relationship remained problematic. At the annual G7 summit in Canada, the two leaders managed only brief formal exchanges. Their body language spoke volumes about the lingering resentment from the Atlantic crisis. Other world leaders noticed the tension and began to factor it into their own diplomatic calculations. The breakthrough in personal relations came from an unexpected source. During a private dinner at the summit, German Chancellor Angela Merkel's successor facilitated a lengthy conversation between the American and French presidents. The Chancellor, a skilled mediator with strong relationships with both leaders, gradually guided them toward a mutual recognition of their shared interests despite their personal differences. "We may not like each other," Trump reportedly said during the dinner, "but we both want our countries to be strong and our people to be safe." Macron's response was equally pragmatic. Personal feelings cannot be allowed to compromise the security of the democratic world. The dinner conversation, while not restoring warmth to their relationship, established a functional working arrangement based on mutual respect for each other's domestic political constraints. Both leaders recognized that their public confrontation had served their respective political bases, but it also created unnecessary risks for global stability. As the first year after the crisis drew to a close, concrete benefits of the new arrangements began to manifest. European defense spending increased significantly as nations invested in the capabilities needed for the defense union. American defense contractors, initially concerned about losing European business, found new opportunities as partners rather than suppliers in European military projects. The most significant development came when France and Germany announced a joint nuclear deterrent program, with Britain as a consulting partner. The program, while controversial, represented the logical conclusion of European strategic autonomy. Trump's administration, after initial concerns, accepted the development as consistent with the principle of burden sharing. Russia and China watched these developments with growing concern. The Atlantic crisis had initially appeared to offer opportunities for driving wedges between Western democracies. Instead, the resolution had produced a more resilient and adaptable alliance structure that was actually more difficult for authoritarian powers to exploit. Putin's first test of the new European resolve came through a series of cyber attacks targeting European infrastructure. The European response was swift and coordinated, with new European cyber defense capabilities proving their worth. American support was provided through established channels, but Europeans took the lead in both defense and retaliation. The success of the European cyber response marked another milestone in the development of true strategic partnership. American officials privately acknowledged that European capabilities had exceeded their expectations, while European leaders gained confidence in their ability to handle major security challenges independently. As the second year of the post-crisis era began, Both sides faced new domestic political pressures that tested their commitment to the London arrangements. In America, Trump faced criticism from foreign policy hawks who argued that European independence weakened American global influence. In Europe, some politicians complained that the arrangement still gave America too much influence over European security decisions. These domestic pressures came to a head during a crisis in the Balkans, where ethnic tensions threatened to reignite old conflicts. European leaders wanted to take the lead in managing the crisis, given their geographical proximity and historical involvement in the region. American officials worried that European-led mediation might fail, requiring costly American intervention. The resolution of the Balkan crisis demonstrated the maturity of the new partnership model. European diplomats took the lead in negotiations, while American officials provided intelligence and logistical support. The successful prevention of renewed conflict validated the principle that regional powers might be better positioned to handle certain types of crises. But the most significant test of the partnership came when intelligence agencies on both sides of the Atlantic uncovered evidence of a coordinated Chinese-Russian effort to exploit Western divisions. The operation, apparently planned during the height of the Atlantic crisis, involved disinformation campaigns, economic pressure, and military posturing designed to drive permanent wedges between America and Europe. The discovery of this coordinated campaign had a sobering effect on leaders in Washington and European capitals. The realization that their public confrontation had been exploited by adversaries provided a powerful incentive for maintaining unity despite ongoing disagreements. Macron and Trump, meeting for the first time since the G7 summit, found themselves united in outrage at the attempt to manipulate their relationship. Their joint statement condemning foreign interference in democratic alliances marked a new phase in their personal interaction, based not on warmth but on shared recognition of external threats. The Chinese-Russian campaign's exposure also led to significant changes in how both sides managed their disagreements. New protocols were established for handling disputes privately before they could be exploited by adversaries. Regular confidential consultations between senior officials became routine, creating channels for resolving problems before they escalated to public confrontations. As the third year of the post-crisis era began, the transformation of the Atlantic relationship was largely complete. What had emerged was neither the old hierarchy nor the complete independence that extremists on both sides had advocated. Instead, a complex but functional partnership had evolved based on equality, mutual respect, and shared interests rather than dominance and subordination. The European Defense Union had become fully operational, with its own command structure, procurement systems, and strategic doctrine, but rather than replacing NATO, it had evolved into a complement that strengthened rather than weakened overall Western defense capabilities. American forces remained in Europe, but in new roles that acknowledged European leadership in regional security matters. The economic relationship had also evolved, with increased European defense spending creating new markets for both American and European companies. Joint development projects replaced simple sales relationships, creating shared stakes in technological advancement and industrial cooperation. Public opinion on both sides of the Atlantic had adapted to the new realities. Europeans had gained confidence in their ability to manage their own security while maintaining valuable partnerships. Americans had learned to accept a more complex world in which allies might disagree on specific issues while remaining committed to shared values and interests. The personal relationship between Trump and Macron never fully recovered from the crisis, but it had evolved into a functional working partnership. Their interactions remained formal and businesslike, but they had learned to work together effectively on issues of mutual concern. The dramatic confrontation of the Atlantic crisis had given way to mature, if not warm, cooperation. Looking back on the events of those tumultuous months, historians would later identify the Atlantic crisis as a crucial turning point in the evolution of democratic alliances. The confrontation had brought long-simmering tensions to the surface and forced a fundamental rethinking of relationships that had remained essentially unchanged since the end of World War II. The resolution had required wisdom, flexibility, and political courage from leaders on both sides of the Atlantic. The temptation to allow personal animosity and domestic political considerations to override broader strategic interests had been strong, but ultimately, the recognition of shared threats and values had prevailed. The world that emerged from the crisis was more complex and challenging than the one that had existed before, but it was also more honest about the realities of power and the legitimate aspirations of democratic peoples. The Atlantic Alliance had survived its greatest test since its founding, not by avoiding change, but by embracing it, creating new structures and relationships that reflected the evolving global balance of power while preserving the essential unity of the democratic world.